Guard is shameful, it's dangerous, and in another troubling instance of the Trump administration normalizing the threat of Nazism and white supremacy. This policy had all the markings of a dog whistle. It's a stand back and stand by in the form of an office memo. Not 4 days ago, as I mentioned, 15 Jews were slaughtered in cold blood. Beautiful picture of a little 10-year-old girl celebrating the first night of Hanukkah. And a day later, the Trump administration chose to soften its stance against Nazis and swastikas. Can you believe it? Can it get any lower? Can it get any more insensitive? Can they be any more in a bubble than they're in? And for all the millions of American men and women who served in the Coast Guard, this is an insult to them. How about the Coast Guard members who served during World War II and fought that swastika?
So you heard those words from Chuck Schumer and you felt that rage ignite in your chest because this is what fascism looks like when it happens in real time. And here's the bombshell that's going to explode everything you thought you understood about how power operates in this country. Because what we just witnessed was not some bureaucratic policy adjustment or some administrative oversight, but rather the methodical normalization of genocidal imagery in the institutional memory of a military service. And you need to understand right now that the Coast Guard shifted from a 2019 policy stating that swastikas were widely identified with oppression or hatred to calling them potentially divisive. And if your blood isn't boiling yet, then let me tell you what happened in the days leading up to this obscene policy change, because 15 people were shot and killed in a targeted attack on a Jewish holiday celebration marking the start of Hanukkah at Australia's Bondi Beach. And that was literally days before this administration decided that the swastika deserved linguistic rehabilitation. And if you think that's coincidence, then you haven't been paying attention to how white supremacist movements operate through the machinery of state power, because this is the architecture of oppression being rebuilt brick by methodical brick. Now here comes the part that should terrify every single person who understands how Gramscian hegemony functions in late capitalist societies, because on his first day in office, President Trump dismissed Admiral Linda Fagan, the first woman to lead a military branch, citing her focus on DEI initiatives, and then acting Commandant Kevin Lundy suspended the Coast Guard's previous hazing and harassment policy, which had explicitly listed swastikas and nooses as symbols requiring investigation. And what you're witnessing is the systematic dismantling of institutional safeguards against hate, and the replacement of those safeguards with a bureaucratic vocabulary that treats Nazi iconography as though it were merely a subject of polite disagreement, rather than the visual embodiment of industrialized murder. And let me pause here because this next revelation is going to shake your understanding of how fascist organizing happens beneath the surface of democratic institutions, because service members now have only 45 days to formally report the display of a noose or swastika, whereas previous policy had no deadline, and Coast Guard members can be deployed for months at a time, making the complaint process far more difficult, which means that if you're a Jewish service member or a black service member and you're trapped at sea for 60 days, staring at a swastika in your shipmates' quarters, you now have a ticking clock on your ability to seek protection from the institutional apparatus that's supposed to safeguard your dignity. Let's talk about dog whistles for a moment, because scholars of racial politics have documented extensively how political correctness can be deployed as a white power dog whistle. And like other racist dog whistles, Trump uses his invocations, stoke racial division, and engender grievance, discord, distrust, and even violence. And what Schumer correctly identified in that clip was that this policy change functioned as stand back and stand by in memo form. And you remember stand back and stand by, don't you? Because that was Trump's message to the Proud Boys during the debate. Shortly after his comment, the Proud Boys began to use those words as a new slogan, and on the group's public Telegram channel, some members boasted of Trump's answer, which demonstrates empirically how these coded messages travel through white supremacist networks and activate organized hate movements. And now we have another such message encoded in the bureaucratic language of military policy, telling white nationalists that their symbols are being downgraded from hate to mere divisiveness. And if you don't think they're celebrating this linguistic shift on their encrypted channels, then you fundamentally misunderstand how fascist organizing operates in digital spaces. But wait, because here's where this gets even more sinister, and you need to steel yourself for what I'm about to reveal, because the new policy prevents Coast Guard officers from immediately removing white supremacist symbols upon discovery, and commanders are now instructed to consult legal counsel before determining whether a symbol violates policy and adversely affects morale, unit cohesion, or mission readiness, which means that the swastika gets to stay up on the wall, while lawyers deliberate its contextual meaning and its potential impact on unit cohesion, as though there's some universe in which the most recognizable symbol of genocidal antisemitism might not adversely affect the morale of Jewish service members, or as though the swastika, which epitomizes Hitler's murderous regime that killed millions during the Holocaust, requires legal interpretation before commanding officers can act. And this is how institutional violence operates, through procedural delay, through the construction of bureaucratic obstacles that transform urgent moral imperatives into extended deliberative processes. Now Cornell law professor Menachem Rosensaft, who is also a Jewish community leader, articulated this with devastating clarity when he stated the swastika is the ultimate symbol of virulent hate and bigotry, and even a consideration by the Coast Guard to no longer classify it as such would be equivalent to dismissing the Ku Klux Klan's burning crosses and hoods as merely potentially divisive, and this comparison illuminates the historical continuum of white supremacist terror in America. Because the noose and the swastika are not merely symbols, they are technologies of intimidation, they are visual representations of genocidal intent, and when a military service of the United States government decides to soften its language around these images, it is participating in what scholars call the banalization of evil, the process by which horrific violence becomes administratively normalized through euphemistic language and bureaucratic procedure. And here's the part that exposes the entire cynical machinery of this administration's approach to anti-Semitism, because they will simultaneously claim to be the greatest defenders of Jewish people, while enacting policies that make Jewish service members materially less safe. And you saw this doublespeak when the administration initially denied everything, and the Coast Guard said claims that it will no longer classify swastikas, nooses, or other extremist imagery as prohibited symbols are categorically false, and these symbols have been and remain prohibited. But then, after widespread backlash, the Coast Guard changed the policy again, saying that divisive or hate symbols and flags are prohibited, which means they got caught. They tried to sneak through a policy that downgraded Nazi symbols. They faced immediate public outrage, and then they backtracked while claiming they never did what they demonstrably did. And this gaslighting is itself a form of institutional violence, because it undermines our collective ability to name what we're witnessing and to hold power accountable for its actions. Let's return to that Hanukkah massacre in Sydney, because more than 1,000 people were on Bondi Beach when shots rang out during a celebration of the first day of Hanukkah. Rabbi Eli Schlanger, who helped organize the Hanukkah event, was named among the 11 people killed, and he had served as rabbi and chaplain in the Bondi community for 18 years, and the vehicle linked to the gunman contained 2 homemade ISIS flags, and this was a targeted anti-Semitic terrorist attack that murdered a rabbi who had recently warned against anti-Semitism while he was lighting candles to celebrate a festival of light and resistance against oppression. And just days after this horror, just days after Jewish families across the world were processing this trauma, the Trump administration decided to move forward with a policy that semantically minimized the swastika. And if you cannot see the cruelty in that timing, if you cannot perceive the message being sent, then you need to examine how deeply you've been conditioned to accept the unacceptable. But we also need to situate this within the broader historical context of anti-Semitic violence in America, because in 2019, which is the year that original strong Coast Guard policy was implemented, there were 3 major attacks on the Jewish community, including a white supremacist opening fire at Chabad of Poway, killing 2 individuals attacking a Jewish grocery store in Jersey City, killing 3, and an individual attacking a Hanukkah party at the home of a rabbi in Monsey, New York, with a knife resulting in 4 injuries and 1 fatality. And that Monsey attack is the one Schumer was referencing in the clip when he talked about the beautiful picture of a 10-year-old girl celebrating the first night of Hanukkah, because on December 28, 2019, the 7th night of Hanukkah, a masked man wielding a large knife invaded the home of a Hasidic rabbi in Monsey, where a Hanukkah party was underway, and began stabbing guests and... According to the FBI, the suspect appears to have been driven by anti-Semitism, citing journals and internet search history, which allegedly reveal a pattern of hateful anti-Semitic leaning, and that policy that the Coast Guard implemented in 2019 was a direct response to this wave of anti-Semitic terror, and now 6 years later, this administration decided to weaken those protections. And you need to understand the material consequences of these policy changes, because an anonymous Coast Guard official said to the Washington Post, "If you are at sea and your shipmate has a swastika in their rack, and you are a black person or Jew, and you are going to be stuck at sea with them for the next 60 days, are you going to feel safe reporting that up your chain of command?" And that same official said, "We don't deserve the trust of the nation if we're unclear about the divisiveness of swastikas," which reveals that there are people inside these institutions who understand exactly what's happening, who recognize the danger, who are willing to speak anonymously because they fear reprisal, and this is how authoritarianism consolidates power through the silencing of dissent within institutions, through the creation of climates of fear, where the people who know better are afraid to speak up because they've watched what happens to whistleblowers and truth-tellers under this administration. Now let's excavate the theoretical frameworks that help us understand what's happening, because scholars like Ian Haney Lopez have documented extensively how racial dog whistles function in American politics, and in his book Merge Left, Lopez notes that dog whistling has mutated, and in the age of Trump things are metastasizing into monstrous versions of what they used to look like, and we see the resemblance to past dog whistling, but we've also never seen anything this vitriolic before, and what we're witnessing is the evolution from dog whistle to what some scholars have called foghorn politics, where racial foghorns are loud, abrasive, and direct appeals to white supremacy, and their resurgence emanated from far-right online media, and among those who trafficked heaviest in their use was Trump, and the Coast Guard policy change is part of this broader strategy of making explicit what was previously coded, of bringing white supremacist organizing out from the shadows and into the institutional frameworks of government. And here's where we need to talk about the broader pattern, because the Coast Guard's move comes amid broader efforts by the Trump administration to roll back military guidance related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has called many existing harassment and hazing rules overly broad, arguing that they threaten mission readiness, which is the new justification for dismantling civil rights protections. The claim that protecting people from discrimination somehow undermines operational effectiveness, as though Jewish and black service members being forced to serve alongside people displaying symbols of genocidal hatred doesn't undermine unit cohesion, as though the real threat to military readiness is not white supremacy, but rather the policies designed to combat white supremacy. And this inversion of cause and effect, this Orwellian restructuring of logic, is central to how fascist movements justify their actions through claims of institutional necessity. Let me tell you what Senator Jackie Rosen said, because she said the policy rolls back important protections against bigotry and could allow for horrifically hateful symbols like swastikas and nooses to be inexplicably permitted to be displayed, and at a time when anti-Semitism is rising in the United States and around the world, relaxing policies aimed at fighting hate crimes not only sends the wrong message to the men and women of our Coast Guard, but it puts their safety at risk, and this is the material reality that gets obscured in debates about free speech and political correctness, because we're not talking about abstract principles, we're talking about whether Jewish service members will feel safe in their bunks, whether black service members will trust their chain of command, whether the military will be a place where white supremacists feel emboldened or constrained. Now think about what Schumer said in that clip about the Coast Guard members who served during World War II and fought that swastika because about 1,900 died while serving in the Coast Guard during World War II against Germany. And those service members gave their lives fighting fascism, fighting the regime that the swastika represents. And now, 79 years after the defeat of Nazi Germany, we have a United States military service debating whether the swastika should be classified as a hate symbol or merely as potentially divisive. And this represents not just a policy failure, but a moral catastrophe, a civilizational regression that would be incomprehensible to the generation that fought and died to defeat fascism in Europe. And we need to name what this is because in the framework of critical race theory, this is an example of interest convergence, where civil rights protections are only maintained when they align with the interests of dominant groups, and the moment those protections are perceived as threatening to white comfort or white institutional power, they are systematically dismantled. And what we're seeing is the Trump administration calculating that there is more political utility in signaling to white nationalist movements that their symbols are being normalized than there is in protecting Jewish and black service members from hate and terror, and this calculation reveals the fundamental logic of white supremacy as a governing ideology. It will always sacrifice the safety of marginalized people to consolidate the comfort and power of the dominant group. But here's what gives me hope, even as I'm enraged, because the backlash was immediate, and it was fierce, and the quick back and forth over the Coast Guard's policy drew national attention amid heightened concerns over anti-Semitism and hate crimes in the U.S. military and broader society. And they had to reverse course, they had to issue a new policy, they had to publicly backtrack because the moral clarity of the opposition was undeniable, because people like Schumer stood up and called it what it was: disgusting, dangerous, a dog whistle, a stand back and stand by in memo form. And this demonstrates that resistance works, that calling out fascist policies by their proper names creates political costs that thus even this administration cannot entirely ignore. And yet we cannot allow ourselves to be placated by the reversal, because the fact that they tried this at all, the fact that they drafted this policy, the fact that Acting Commandant Luna suspended the previous harassment policy, the fact that they thought they could get away with downgrading the swastika. All of this reveals their intention, and intention matters because it shows us what they will do the moment they think they can get away with it. Trump's ascendancy marked the point where we can no longer deny the normalcy of white supremacy within our political system, and his administration firmly and openly embraces white supremacy and coded appeals to white anxiety, and the Coast Guard policy was just one manifestation of this broader project. So when Schumer asks, can you believe it? Can it get any lower? Can it get any more insensitive? Can they be any more in a bubble? The answer is yes, it can always get lower, because fascism operates through the systematic erosion of norms, through the normalization of the previously unthinkable, through the transformation of moral outrages into bureaucratic procedures, and the only thing that stops this descent is collective resistance, is the refusal to accept the unacceptable, is the insistence on calling these policies what they are, which is anti-Semitic, which is racist, which is fascist, and we cannot allow ourselves to be gaslit by their denials or reassured by their reversals, because the fight is not over when they back down. The fight continues because they have shown us who they are, and we need to believe them and organize accordingly, because this is just the beginning of what they will attempt, and the only question is whether we will have the moral courage and the political organization to stop them at every turn.